Hi everyone. I wanted to create a video on speed training or the dynamic effort method and just get some information out there as to why you might want to include it in your training or maybe might not want to include it in your training. We'll go over some of the pros and cons. I have included speed training in my training in the past and had good success. I've also had time periods where I didn't have any type of dynamic effort or speed training in my programming, and I've had success as well. So I think that's up for you to determine, and I think everyone should experiment with their own training and don't dismiss something just because someone on the internet said it doesn't work, or it doesn't work for raw lifting, or it doesn't work for drug-free lifters. That's nonsense, and everyone will respond differently to different stimulus, and you should experiment for yourself. If you are interested in a certain program or training method, you should give it a go, and don't do it for only a couple weeks and then give up. Give it a good go if you're going to try it. So a lot of the information that I'll go over here today you can find in the Science and Practice of Strength Training, which is a great resource for anyone who's looking for more information on how to structure their strength training or just strength training in general, how we develop strength. It's a really great book, and dynamic effort was kind of made popular by Louis Simmons and Westside Barbell, and whenever he talks about the science and methods behind how they structure their training, he always refers to the science and practice of strength training as well as super training. And you can find all of that information right in these books. The same information that he's been talking about for years and years, you can find right in these books, and I think they're great resources for anyone who's looking for more information on that. So the first thing that I want to talk about when it comes to speed work or dynamic effort work, and some of the reasons why we implement it in our training for powerlifters or just for athletes, is the explosive strength deficit. So if we have a movement that has a time factor to it, so let's say throwing a shot put, for instance, I think is a great example. A shot put thrower has a time factor to their movement. They have a time limit. So from the moment they start moving or throwing the shot put till it leaves their hands, they only have a certain amount of time to generate force, and it's very, very small. They actually only have about 0.15 seconds to generate force before that shot put starts to leave their hand. So in that case, the rate of force development becomes extremely important, or how fast they can generate a high amount of force. The faster they can generate force, the more force they will have into the shot put, leaving their hands. So if we look at the graph here in the upper left-hand corner, along the vertical axis we have force, and along the horizontal axis we have time. So in this example, our max force for this person is way up here. That is the max amount of force they're able to generate, not given the time limit. So if they had no time limit, they could generate this high amount of force way up here. This number way down here is the amount of force they're able to generate given the time factor. So in that limited amount of time, they're only able to generate this much force. So the difference between the max amount of force the person is able to generate and the amount of force they're able to generate within that time limit is the explosive strength deficit. So the goal for this person would be to close that explosive strength deficit. And that can become even more important than working on increasing their max force, especially for athletes, shot put throwers, football players, basketball players. This becomes very important. Working on rate of force development, how fast you can generate a high amount of force. So when it comes to powerlifting, the argument against this would be that the time factor within the 3 lifts is definitely not as short as a shot put thrower, and it can be kind of long. We've all seen the deadlifts that last 6-7 seconds, people grinding out their benches, squats. So given the longer time frame, we will get closer to max force in all of the lifts. So that would be kind of an argument against focusing on rate of force development in powerlifting. But if we move over to the forceful oxidation strength curve that we see here in this graph on the right hand side, you can see up the vertical axis we have force, and along the horizontal axis we have velocity. So as you can see, as force increases, velocity decreases. As velocity increases, force decreases. You cannot move heavy weights fast, weights that are close to your true max. You cannot move them with high velocity, and you cannot generate a high amount of force into a lower weight, a lower load. It's just not physically possible. So that's what the force velocity strength curve is. When we're talking about generating strength, generating power is a big aspect of that, our power output. So if we break down, if we look at the power equation at its simplest form, power equals force times velocity. So looking back at our force velocity strength curve, we know that if force is high, velocity is very low, so that would not be a good area for power generation. And when velocity is very high, force is low, so again, not a good area to work within. You'd want to fall somewhere right in the middle, where you can have a moderate amount of force and a moderate amount of velocity, which would give you the highest power output. And if we think about the way that the dynamic effort method is structured in the West Side method, which is not the only way you can do it. You can do it a bunch of different ways, but it is a good example. The bulk of the work falls right in that middle range where you're using weights from 50 to 60%, along with accommodating resistance, putting it closer to 70 to 80% sometimes. And the bulk of the volume on your dynamic effort day is done right in that range, where power output will be at its highest with a moderate force and moderate velocity. So that falls right in that good range for power output. The last thing that I want to talk about when we're talking about speed training is the strength posture curve, or the force posture curve. So the strength an athlete can generate in a full range of motion depends on their body posture or the angle, the joint angle throughout the motion. So at certain angles, at certain positions throughout the lift, you'll be able to generate more force, and at certain positions, you'll be able to generate less force. If we think about something like the deadlift, when you get past the knees, you can generate more force into the barbell. When we think about something like the bench press, I think for a lot of us, our sticking point falls somewhere around the mid-range, so about a couple inches off our chest. The full range of motion of a lift can only be as strong as our weakest point along that strength posture curve. So if you are hitting your sticking point a couple inches off your chest, or in the deadlift, below the knees, the amount of strength you can generate can only be as much as you're able to generate in the weakest position. So this is where rate of force development, if we go back to the rate of force development, becomes very important for powerlifting. If you're able to generate more force quicker, you will be able to carry that force into your sticking point, or into that weak point within the posture curve, ultimately allowing you to lift more weights or generate more force throughout the entire movement. So the faster you can generate a high amount of force, the higher you'll reach that high amount of force faster, and you will hit your sticking point with a higher amount of force than you would if you were not training that rate of force development. So I hope that makes sense, and I would highly recommend that you look into the science and practice of strength training, or into super training if you are curious about some of these topics that we just went over. And feel free to reach out to me or comment below with any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching.